Another important theme in A Clockwork Orange that Anthony Burgess, I think, is really brilliant at illustrating is something I've actually gotten into it before, which is a person believing that his choices are his own choices, even though he's actually being programmed to make those choices. And as we all know, at the beginning of The Clockwork Orange, before he's so-called rehabilitated, he's a violent juvenile delinquent, 15-year-old kid doing horrible things, rape, murder. But this sort of criminal underworld of the society has all been part of the programming. It's all been designed, even though the criminals believe that they're acting out of these sort of, I guess, for lack of a better word, anarchistic impulses. And that sort of brings into question of all these things about free will being a gray area, basically. But later on, much later on in the story, after he undergoes that horrible treatment, Ludovico treatment, and he then attempts suicide while he's forced to listen to the Ninth Symphony, which happened to be played while he was being tortured earlier on in the story. So now his body and his mind become literally, like, physically ill when he hears it. But then after he is seriously injured after attempting suicide and jumping out of the window of this kind of a relatively small apartment building, so he doesn't end up actually dying, his so-called free will is restored. Like, he goes back to being a psychopath with all of these sexual violent compulsions. But then one of the people who had been like the sort of corrupt official who had visited the prison that he had where he'd been incarcerated much earlier on in the story, looks at him and decides that, okay, hey, well, I think I'm going to use him. I'm actually going to use Alex DeLarge, this criminal in my corrupt government, in this sort of entire corrupt system, and he'd be perfect for it. And this indicates, obviously, how a person can be groomed into believing, having warped notions about their own free will. And even though they were never really free all along, all the times that Alex thought that he was free, he wasn't. Even after he had undergone the treatment and he believed that he's a morally superior person to the way he was, even then he was still a slave. So he just undergoes many different versions of that illusion, but it's ultimately all the same illusion. But I think this overlaps with something that I've been discussing in my own book series about, as I've explained before, in case you haven't watched the other videos, my book series is called The Fall of John Roe. It's about this evil, corrupt aristocracy, a debauched aristocracy that is centered around John Roe being the main villain, the main sort of nobleman who's guilty of sexual violent crimes, and a lot of his legacy gets carried into the modern day, well, actually I should say into the distant future, year 2400. It goes from the Victorian era all the way to 2400. This legacy does not stop. It continues to torture many innocent people. And Dimitri, not Dimitri, John Roe, when he's alive during the Victorian era, is tries to recruit these sort of thuggish, low-life kind of people into his system in very much the same way as you see in the Clockwork Orange. That he tries to look for youth who are impressionable and whose entire conception of their own free will becomes challenged, and that's how they can become easily manipulated. And this is something that hopefully, I think in the third volume of this novel that I want to explore in more detail, because this, I think, if this issue can be solved, I think this would actually nip it in the bud. Like, this would prevent many of the other problems that would await this society on a global scale in the book series.